In the year 629, in the imperial court of Japan, a young woman named Kōmyō was born into the noble family of the Fujiwara. Her father, Fujiwara no Kamatari, was a man of great intellect and ambition, holding powerful sway over the emperor. His deep understanding of court politics and the workings of the imperial house would ultimately shape the destiny of the nation. But Kōmyō, though raised in the heart of the aristocracy, was destined to live a life that would transcend the courtly intrigues and become a symbol of a nation in transition. Kōmyō's early years were marked by the silent whispers of the court, the weight of her lineage, and the promises of a future that was both a privilege and a burden. Her beauty was renowned, but it was her wisdom, her understanding of the world, and her devotion to the Buddhist teachings that would distinguish her in the annals of history. As a child, she would spend long hours in the temple, listening to the teachings of the monks, absorbing the quiet tranquility of the sacred texts. Buddhism, a religion that had swept across the continent from China, was becoming a beacon of hope for many in Japan. And Kōmyō, with her deep spiritual inclinations, would become one of its greatest patrons. Her family's rise in the imperial court came not only through lineage but through astute alliances. Fujiwara no Kamatari, her father, had a vision of a unified Japan under a strong, centralized government. He had been one of the masterminds behind the Taika Reforms, a radical restructuring of the Japanese government in the mid-7th century. These reforms sought to introduce a centralized imperial bureaucracy, inspired by the Chinese Tang dynasty, and break the feudal power of the powerful clans that had long ruled the land. The Taika Reforms were the backbone of the future Japan that Kōmyō would navigate. The winds of change were blowing through the court when she caught the eye of the Emperor Kōtoku Tenno. Unlike other emperors, Kōtoku was not just a figurehead. He was a ruler determined to bring Japan into a new age of governance and enlightenment. He was a man whose ambitions aligned with her own, for his reign would coincide with one of the most turbulent periods in Japanese history. Kōmyō, though young, understood the power that came with being by the side of a visionary emperor. The emperor was in his prime, a man of intellect and resolve, but also one deeply concerned with the spiritual and moral health of his people. He saw in Kōmyō not only a beautiful consort but also a partner in his vision of a unified, spiritually enlightened Japan. Their union was a strategic one, but it was also based on shared ideals, the desire for reform, for a Japan that would no longer be shackled by the old ways of the aristocracy and the regional lords. The daimyo, this shared vision would come to define Kōmyō's role as empress. Kōmyō's early life was far from ordinary, despite her noble origins. Born into a family of power, she was groomed for a life of influence from the moment she opened her eyes to the world. Her father, Fujiwara no Kamatari, was not only a man of intellectual prowess but also an ambitious political figure who had played a significant role in shaping the early years of Emperor Kōtoku's reign. Kamatari had a vision for Japan's future, one where the aristocratic families would be sidelined, and a central, powerful bureaucracy could ensure stability and prosperity. From the very beginning, Kōmyō was taught to navigate the world of politics. Yet, unlike the many women of the court who were used as pawns in the political chess game of imperial marriages, Kōmyō was different. She was not just a beauty with an agreeable temperament. She was also highly intelligent and observant. Her early education was steeped in Buddhist teachings, which her family practiced, but also in the practicalities of governance. Kōmyō learned to read and write the Chinese characters that were the backbone of the scholarly world. She absorbed the nuances of etiquette and diplomacy, and she was taught the arts of poetry and music, skills that were not only expected of women in her position but were also ways of gaining favor within the court. Her devotion to Buddhism, a religion that had already been firmly established in Japan but was still growing in its influence, became central to her identity. As a young woman, she would often accompany her father to the temples where monks would speak of the vast cosmic order of the universe and the path to enlightenment. Kōmyō found solace in the teachings of Buddhism, and this spiritual grounding would later serve as a counterbalance to the treacherous and often violent political struggles that defined the imperial court. The Buddhist doctrine also served as a means of social power. The belief that the emperor's rule was divinely sanctioned by the Buddha meant that those close to the emperor, such as Kōmyō, could present themselves as not just noble figures but as spiritual guides who could offer legitimacy to the emperor's reign. This would later become especially important during the Taika Reforms, which sought to centralize power and align Japan's administration with the more established and powerful systems of China. At the age of 15, Kōmyō's life took a pivotal turn when she was chosen to become the consort of Emperor Kōtoku. The choice of Kōmyō as an empress was both a personal and political decision. Kōtoku, a ruler still finding his way in an unstable court, needed a strong consort, someone whose intelligence, dignity, and spiritual grounding would complement his own vision of a reformed Japan. And in Kōmyō, he saw not only a beautiful woman but also an astute and capable partner. The marriage between Kōmyō and Kōtoku, though born of political necessity, quickly evolved into a deep and respectful partnership. Kōmyō, despite her youth, became a steadying influence on her husband, helping him navigate the complexities of ruling in an era marked by internal strife and external pressures. The Fujiwara family, still influential but wary of the emperor's centralization of power, looked to Kōmyō to maintain a delicate balance. She had to constantly mediate between the emperor's desire to reform the government and the demands of the aristocratic families who controlled much of the nation's wealth and land. The court was rife with political intrigue, but Kōmyō's strategic acumen allowed her to position herself as a figure of stability in the midst of this turmoil. As Kōtoku embarked on his ambitious Taika Reforms, which sought to overhaul the political and social structure of Japan, Kōmyō stood by his side, offering counsel on how best to win the support of the court's elites, while remaining true to the reform's core goals. These reforms aimed at centralizing power under the emperor, redistributing land, and establishing a more bureaucratic government, a direct challenge to the entrenched power of the provincial aristocrats. Kōmyō's understanding of both Buddhist teachings and political affairs made her an invaluable ally in this endeavor. As the years passed, Kōmyō became increasingly influential. Her support for Buddhism, combined with her unwavering commitment to her husband's vision, allowed her to consolidate power within the imperial court. She became known not only as the empress consort but also as a spiritual figure who embodied the connection between the divine and the human realm. Her beauty and grace were celebrated in poetry and art, but it was her intellect, her spiritual devotion, and her political savvy that made her a central figure in the Taika Reforms. However, as the Taika Reforms gained traction, they also faced significant opposition from powerful figures within the court. The system of land ownership, which had allowed the aristocracy to hold sway over the emperor's power, was threatened by the proposed reforms. The centralized bureaucracy envisioned by Kōtoku was viewed by many as an affront to their centuries-old power. The more Kōmyō and her husband pushed forward with their vision, the more they encountered resistance, both from within the court and from powerful military families in the provinces. In the midst of this growing unrest, Kōmyō's position became increasingly precarious. She could no longer simply be the empress consort. She had to become a political force in her own right, maneuvering through the shifting allegiances and dangerous plots of the court. Despite these challenges, Kōmyō remained steadfast in her belief that the reforms were necessary for Japan's future. She worked tirelessly behind the scenes, organizing alliances, ensuring that the emperor's policies were executed, and making sure that those who opposed the reforms were kept in check. Yet, her role was not without its personal sacrifices. As the political climate became more volatile, Kōmyō's relationship with her husband, Emperor Kōtoku, began to show signs of strain. The pressures of ruling a nation in turmoil weighed heavily on the emperor, and his reliance on Kōmyō grew. She had become not only his consort but his closest confidant, a position that forced her into a delicate balancing act between supporting her husband and ensuring the stability of the court. The great shifts of the 7th century were upon Japan, and Kōmyō stood at the precipice of history. She was not just an empress in title. She was a central figure in a political landscape that was being remade from the ground up. The imperial court, once dominated by powerful families like the Soga, was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own corruption. The assassination of Soga no Irika in 645, a coup orchestrated by Kōmyō's father, Fujiwara no Kamatari, marked the beginning of a new era. The reign of Emperor Kōtoku, who had been weak and indecisive, suddenly found itself under the influence of those who had helped orchestrate the coup. But in the heart of this turbulent time, Kōmyō found herself thrust into a position of power, one she never expected but which she would learn to wield with grace and cunning. Her marriage to Emperor Kōtoku, although arranged as part of a political alliance, quickly evolved into something deeper. Kōmyō, still a young woman, had watched as the emperor's court struggled under the weight of its own corruption. She had witnessed the infighting, the rise and fall of ministers, the scheming of factions that all sought their place in the new order. But where others saw chaos, Kōmyō saw opportunity. Her deep understanding of Buddhist philosophy gave her an uncommon perspective on power. Buddhism, after all, taught of impermanence, of the fleeting nature of life, and the necessity of harmony. Kōmyō was deeply influenced by this, seeing her own life as part of a larger cosmic order, one in which personal ambitions could either contribute to or destroy that balance. Her devotion to Buddhism was not just spiritual, it became a political strategy. At a time when many in the court were concerned with worldly power, Kōmyō's sincerity and integrity stood out. She built strong relationships with Buddhist monks, understanding that the clergy held influence over the people. As the Taika Reforms began to take shape, Kōmyō used her position not only to support her husband's rule, but also to weave Buddhism into the very fabric of the political reforms that were taking place. The Taika Reforms, initiated after the coup against the Soga clan, sought to establish a more centralized imperial government, with land redistribution and the creation of a bureaucratic state modeled on Chinese governance. However, these changes were not without resistance, and it was within this atmosphere of change that Kōmyō would rise to prominence. She was an astute observer, aware of the complex politics surrounding her. Despite her own powerful family connections, she was not quick to trust anyone. She knew that within the court, alliances could shift as quickly as the tides. Many of the men in power viewed women as little more than figures of decorum. But Kōmyō defied those expectations. She was not just a passive player in the game of politics. She was a quiet but steady force behind the throne, offering advice, supporting key reforms, and subtly guiding Emperor Kōtoku when the court's factionalism became overwhelming. During this time, she began to find her voice as a political player. The emperor, while well-meaning, was often indecisive, and it was in those moments of uncertainty that Kōmyō stepped in. Her insights into the complex dynamics of power within the court were unparalleled, and she knew just when to influence Kotoku's decisions without seeming overbearing. She worked quietly but effectively behind the scenes, forging alliances, maintaining balance, and ensuring the continuity of the Taika Reforms even as rivals sought to undo them. But Kōmyō was not a woman who sought power for its own sake. Unlike many of her male counterparts, who chased personal glory and material wealth, her ambitions were always for the good of the state, for the preservation of order and peace. She saw the turmoil within the court as part of a larger divine plan, a series of events leading to greater stability and enlightenment. Her vision of an ideal state was one where the emperor ruled with wisdom, supported by a strong central bureaucracy, and where the people were guided by both the law and Buddhist teachings. Despite her growing influence, Kōmyō knew that power, like everything else, was temporary. She had witnessed too many courtly rivalries, too many assassinations, and too many betrayals to believe that anything, even the throne, was secure forever. Still, she worked tirelessly to strengthen the imperial court's foundations. implementing reforms that would last long after her own time. Her legacy, she hoped, would be one of peace and prosperity, a time when Japan was united under a wise and just ruler. As the years passed, Kōmyō's influence continued to grow. The court began to reflect her vision. It became more organized, more harmonious, and, in many ways, more prosperous. The implementation of the Taika Reforms, though flawed and incomplete, laid the groundwork for the later Nara period, a time when Japan would experience significant cultural and political advancements. But with power came danger. Kōmyō's influence, while steady, did not go unnoticed by her enemies. In the court, there were always those who were jealous of her rise, those who feared her influence, and those who plotted to bring her down. The emperor's ministers, once loyal, began to eye her with suspicion, and Kōmyō realized that her position, though powerful, was precarious. She had to walk a fine line between loyalty to her husband and the ever-present need to protect herself from the political currents that swirled around her. Kōmyō's story is not just one of political intrigue. It is the story of a woman who navigated an era of intense transformation with intelligence, grace, and determination. She was a woman who saw the world not just through the lens of power, but through the lens of spiritual insight. And it was this unique combination that allowed her to play such a pivotal role in Japan's early imperial history. The tumultuous political climate that surrounded Kōmyō during her early years as empress was nothing short of a crucible for her strength. Her father's influence had secured her position at the heart of the court, but it was the political upheaval that defined the early years of her marriage to Emperor Kōtoku. By the time she ascended to her role as Empress Consort, Japan was in the throes of one of its most profound transitions, the Taika Reform, a series of sweeping political and social reforms that sought to consolidate imperial power and introduce Chinese-style governance, had begun to take root. The death of Soga no Irika had ended the stranglehold the Soga clan held over the imperial family, but it also opened a new phase of political instability. It was a time of shifting allegiances, power struggles, and the hard-fought efforts of influential families to secure their place within the new order. Amidst this backdrop, Kōmyō's intelligence and sense of duty made her an indispensable figure in the emperor's court. The Empress Consort was expected to be more than just a symbol of beauty and fertility. She was meant to help guide the emperor, support the reformative agenda, and influence the religious and cultural practices that would shape the future of Japan. While Emperor Kōtoku was often seen as indecisive and vulnerable to manipulation, Kōmyō's wisdom earned her respect not just within the court but also among the powerful Buddhist clergy, whose influence was on the rise. One of the most significant factors in Kōmyō's life was her devotion to Buddhism. While this was not unusual for members of the aristocracy, Kōmyō's personal commitment to the Buddhist faith went beyond mere lip service. She was a patron of temples, a supporter of Buddhist scholars, and a proponent of the teachings that had begun to spread throughout Japan. Her advocacy for Buddhism was not merely a religious inclination. It was also a strategic maneuver within the political realm. The influence of the Buddhist clergy was growing, and the emperor's court recognized the importance of securing the support of this powerful faction. Kōmyō's association with Buddhism was not merely symbolic. It was a tool that she used to build alliances, strengthen her position, and ensure that the Taika Reforms could take root in a society that was still steeped in ancient traditions. She worked closely with the court's Buddhist monks, most notably with figures such as Gyoki, a popular Buddhist priest who had a profound influence on the common people. Gyoki's teachings focused on compassion, social justice, and the importance of a Buddhist-centered state, which aligned closely with the reforms being pushed forward by the emperor and his supporters. It was during this period of political and religious change that Kōmyō became a pivotal figure in the court. While Emperor Kōtoku may have lacked the strength to navigate the ever-changing political currents, Kōmyō's ability to cultivate relationships and build consensus within the court allowed her to subtly influence the direction of the reforms. She was not merely a passive participant in her husband's reign. She was a force in her own right, using her position to advocate for a more centralized, stable governance system while ensuring that Buddhist principles permeated the state. Despite the political turmoil surrounding her, Kōmyō's role as a mother was central to her identity as empress. She gave birth to several children, including a son, Prince Soi, who would later become Emperor Tenji. The position of the heir to the throne was always precarious, especially in an era where succession disputes were frequent, and the line of succession could shift dramatically with the death of an emperor. As the mother of the future emperor, Kōmyō's position was not just a personal role, it was a dynastic one, laden with the weight of history. Her children represented the future of Japan, and Kōmyō's role as mother allowed her to consolidate her power further. In an imperial court where intrigue was common, her status as the mother of the heir put her in a particularly advantageous position. In a sense, she became the embodiment of the stability that the country desperately needed during this period of transition. This role as both a political and maternal figure was not lost on the people of Japan, who began to view Kōmyō as a symbol of unity and continuity. However, the stability Kōmyō had worked so hard to maintain would not last. In 654, Emperor Kōtoku died suddenly, and Kōmyō found herself in a precarious situation. As a widow and the mother of the crown prince, she had to navigate a complex political landscape that was still riddled with factionalism, power struggles, and shifting alliances. The death of Kōtoku left the throne in a delicate balance, and Kōmyō's role as the mother of the heir became even more crucial. In the wake of the emperor's death, the court was thrown into disarray. The powerful families that had backed the Taika Reforms, most notably the Fujiwara, now found themselves at odds with other factions. With the throne in flux, the question of who would rule Japan next became a matter of fierce competition. Kōmyō, now a widow and with her son still too young to assume the throne, found herself in a position where her every move would be scrutinized. But she was not one to sit idly by. The political maneuvering that followed Kōtoku's death saw Kōmyō assert her power quietly but effectively. She worked behind the scenes, meeting with the leaders of various factions, ensuring that her son's future as emperor was secured. Her deep understanding of court politics and her connections to the Buddhist clergy provided her with the leverage she needed to solidify her son's position as the next emperor. The final years of Kōmyō's life saw Japan on the brink of monumental change. While she was not able to steer the course of history single-handedly, her influence during the reigns of both Emperor Kōtoku and her son, Emperor Tenji, was immeasurable. She had helped lay the groundwork for the success of the Taika Reforms, though their full implementation would come later. Under her son's reign, by the time of her death, Kōmyō had become a revered figure in Japanese history, not just for her role as empress, but for her strength, wisdom, and determination to guide her nation through one of its most challenging periods. Her legacy was not one of a passive consort or a mere political pawn. She had been an active participant in shaping the future of the Japanese Empire, securing her place as one of the most important women in the history of Japan's early imperial period. As the Taika Reform took hold, reshaping the political and administrative framework of Japan, Kōmyō found herself playing an ever more vital role in the cultural and religious shifts of the time. The reforms, which sought to consolidate imperial power and curb the influence of the aristocracy, also had profound implications for religion, specifically the rise of Buddhism as the state-supported faith. Though Buddhism had been present in Japan for centuries, it had never been fully integrated into the political and spiritual life of the nation. The influence of the Soga clan, who had long supported the spread of Buddhism, was eliminated after their fall, and the emperor and his advisors began to seek a more direct and formal relationship between the state and religion. But it was Kōmyō who became a pivotal figure in this development, her personal devotion to the Buddhist faith guiding her actions. From a young age, Kōmyō had been drawn to the serenity and wisdom of Buddhism. Raised by her father, who had been a patron of the faith, she had absorbed its teachings alongside the rigorous education required for courtly life. But unlike many of her contemporaries, Kōmyō was not content to simply uphold the faith as a symbol of status or a tool for political maneuvering. She became a true believer, seeking to understand the deeper tenets of Buddhism and integrating them into her role as empress. Her husband, Emperor Kōtoku, was less spiritually inclined, though he recognized the importance of aligning the throne with the Buddhist establishment. In this, Kōmyō's influence was pivotal. As the empress, she became a key patron of Buddhist temples, overseeing the construction of numerous monasteries and shrines across Japan. Perhaps most notably, she took part in the establishment of the Hokoji, a temple that would become one of the most influential Buddhist sites in the country. But Kōmyō's role as a religious patron was not without challenges. The emperor's court was divided on the issue of Buddhism's role in statecraft. While many in the Fujiwara family, particularly her father Fujiwara no Kamatari, supported Buddhism as a tool for reinforcing imperial power, others in the court feared that the growing influence of the Buddhist clergy might undermine the power of the nobility. These factions would often come into conflict, with Kōmyō caught in the middle. However, Kōmyō's role in promoting Buddhism was not merely political. Her personal faith and commitment to the religion shaped how she engaged with the court and its policies. She became a spiritual advisor not only to the emperor but also to the other court women and officials who sought her counsel. Through her leadership, she helped cultivate an atmosphere of religious devotion that would influence generations to come. Despite her growing influence in religious matters, Kōmyō's life was far from easy. The court was a battlefield, not only for power but also for control over the emperor's decisions. As the emperor's consort, Kōmyō was expected to support the emperor in his political role. Yet she was often kept in the shadows, forced to navigate the complex web of politics that defined the imperial court. She had few true allies, as the Taika Reforms themselves created divisions within the court. The reforms, which sought to curtail the power of noble families and centralize governance, were both radical and unsettling to many of Japan's established elites. The growing centralization of power under the emperor and the court's efforts to emulate Chinese-style bureaucracy created a volatile atmosphere of distrust and rebellion. One of the key political challenges Kōmyō faced was the continued power struggle between the Fujiwara clan and other aristocratic families, particularly the Soga clan and the Nakatomi clan. The fall of the Soga family had left a power vacuum, one that various factions sought to fill. While her father's position as the chief minister gave Kōmyō significant influence, it also placed her in the crosshairs of those who sought to usurp her family's power. Her father's enemies were numerous, and they were not above plotting to undermine both her and her husband. Kōmyō's role in the court was a delicate balancing act. She had to maintain the respect of the emperor, who depended on her counsel, while also asserting her own influence in the face of rising political opposition. This was especially true as her own family's grip on power began to weaken, and Kōmyō had to navigate the shifting alliances of court factions. Her devotion to Buddhism was an asset, but it also created its own set of difficulties. Many courtiers, especially those who were secular or whose power was tied to the old aristocratic families, were distrustful of her faith. There were whispers behind her back, rumors that she was attempting to replace the traditional Shinto practices with foreign-influenced ideologies. The tension between Buddhism and Shinto, the indigenous faith of Japan, reached a fever pitch as Kōmyō worked tirelessly to promote the former. The clash between these two religions was emblematic of the larger conflict playing out in the court, as Japan underwent profound shifts in its social and political fabric. The tension between the old ways and the new became more apparent. Kōmyō, though a woman of profound intelligence and spirituality, was often forced to act as a mediator in this ongoing battle. She was the epitome of the new Japan, a woman shaped by ancient traditions but also willing to embrace the changes that would bring the country into a new era. In the midst of these struggles, Kōmyō's influence only grew. Her devotion to the emperor and her commitment to the Buddhist faith made her an essential figure in the court's power structure. But as she gained power and influence, She also made enemies, some within the imperial family, and others among the powerful families vying for control. Even as her relationship with Emperor Kōtoku deepened, it was clear that the political landscape would remain fraught with tension. But despite the challenges she faced, Kōmyō's legacy as a powerful empress, a patron of Buddhism, and a political leader would endure long after her reign. She would not be remembered simply for her role in securing the power of the Fujiwara family or for the temples she built, but for her strength and conviction in the face of immense adversity. As the political and religious struggles continued to unfold, Kōmyō stood resolute, her mind focused on the future of her country, her faith, and her family. As the years passed, Kōmyō's position as Empress Consort to Emperor Kōtoku solidified. The political atmosphere remained volatile, and the emperor's reign, though initially promising, was fraught with instability. The ambitious Taika Reforms, which sought to centralize power and establish a more bureaucratic form of governance, were met with resistance from the nobility and local clans who held entrenched power. The emperor, though supported by Kōmyō and her father Fujiwara no Kametari, was weak in his ability to command the factions within his court. In these uncertain years, Kōmyō's role was one of quiet but formidable influence. Her father's reforms had started to reshape the political structure, but their implementation was slow, and many of the high-ranking court officials, who had benefited from the previous order, resisted these changes. In this environment of political infighting, Kōmyō navigated the treacherous waters with a combination of tact, foresight, and personal belief in the righteousness of the Taika Reforms. She worked behind the scenes to advise her husband, helping him maintain a tenuous hold on power. Yet, despite her support for her husband's reign, Kōmyō knew that the empire's future could not solely depend on the emperor's weak leadership. The court was rife with factions, and the ambitions of the Fujiwara clan, her own family, were beginning to take precedence over the emperor's intentions. Fujiwara no Kametari, her father, was one of the chief architects of the reforms, but his ambitions for his own family's power grew. The Fujiwara had long held a powerful position in Japan, but now, with the backing of the emperor, Kōmyō's family sought to consolidate their power even further. The tension in the court reached its peak when Kōmyō's father, Fujiwara no Kametari, was murdered in a palace coup. This event marked a dramatic turning point in Kōmyō's life, as it heralded not only the loss of her most trusted political ally but also the end of the reign of Emperor Kōtoku. His sudden death in 654 left the empire in turmoil, a position Kōmyō could not have foreseen. While the reasons behind the assassination remain shrouded in mystery, many historians suggest that it was a result of internal court politics, power struggles, and betrayal. The death of Emperor Kōtoku sent shockwaves through the court. In the aftermath of his passing, Kōmyō was faced with not only the grief of losing her husband, but also the daunting task of ensuring that her family's legacy and the reforms her father had fought so hard to instate would survive. She took it upon herself to guide the young prince, the future Emperor Tenji, who was now thrust into the spotlight as the new ruler of Japan. Kōmyō's ability to navigate these shifting political currents, to ensure the stability of her family's power, and to maintain her father's reforms, would become a testament to her intelligence and resilience. She worked closely with the court, using her influence to secure positions for her family and to protect her son, who was now at the mercy of the court's ever-changing allegiances. But Kōmyō's influence was not solely limited to political maneuvering. In her personal life, she continued to be a devout Buddhist, guiding the court's embrace of the faith and maintaining the importance of religion within the imperial family. It was said that Kōmyō's devotion was so deep that she would personally fund the building of temples and engage in charitable acts, ensuring the spread of Buddhism throughout Japan. Her actions during this turbulent period, however, were not without opposition. Some of the nobility began to question her power, seeing her as an obstacle to their own ambitions. Yet, Kōmyō's position as empress was undeniable, and her authority remained intact. In the eyes of the people and the court, she was the embodiment of grace, wisdom, and strength, an unshakable pillar in the face of adversity. As the years passed, and with the death of Emperor Kōtoku, Kōmyō's own role within the court shifted. She no longer held the title of Empress Consort, but her influence remained steadfast. Her son, Emperor Tenji, rose to power, inheriting not just his father's throne but also the legacy of the reforms that Kōmyō had worked tirelessly to protect. Under his reign, Japan would continue to evolve, building on the foundation that Kōmyō had helped to lay. In the later years of her life, Kōmyō's influence began to wane as new political players entered the court and the power dynamics shifted once again. Her family's hold over the court weakened, and the reforms that had been so carefully crafted began to lose their steam. But despite this, Kōmyō's impact on the court and on the course of Japanese history remained indelible. She spent her final years in quiet reflection, retreating from the political machinations of the court and returning to her spiritual practice. Her devotion to Buddhism remained a central part of her identity, and she continued to champion the religion's growth throughout the empire. It is said that before her death, she gave a final donation to a temple, ensuring that her legacy would continue to be tied to the faith she had so deeply revered. Kōmyō passed away in 661, having lived through some of Japan's most formative years. Her death marked the end of an era, and yet, her influence lived on. Emperor Tenji, now firmly in control of the empire, would go on to oversee the continued centralization of Japan's political structure, and the Taika Reforms would continue to shape the future of the nation. But none of this would have been possible without the quiet strength, intelligence, and unwavering faith of Empress Kōmyō. The twilight years of Kōmyō's life were marked by both triumph and tragedy. The political landscape of Japan, once riddled with internal strife, had begun to shift toward a more unified imperial structure under the rule of her son, Emperor Tenji. The death of Emperor Kōtoku in 654 brought an end to an era of turmoil, but it also ushered in a new age, an age in which Kōmyō's vision, quiet yet profound, would leave an indelible mark on the course of Japanese history. The years following the death of her husband were not easy. Kōmyō had been deeply devoted to Kōtoku, not only as her husband but also as the emperor who had, in his own way, supported the sweeping reforms of the Taika period. Yet, with his death, the empress was forced to confront the complex reality of court life without her most powerful ally. Her influence at court, while formidable, now faced new challenges. Factions shifted, and her position became precarious. But Kōmyō was a survivor. Through her deep faith, her political acumen, and her unwavering sense of duty to the imperial family, she navigated these difficult years with a wisdom that would come to define her legacy. Her greatest achievement during this period was the role she played in securing the throne for her son, Prince Otomo, who would later become Emperor Tenji. Though the power dynamics in the court were often fluid, Kōmyō's support proved crucial in cementing her son's place in the line of succession. Through strategic alliances, a careful cultivation of favor among key court officials, and a quiet strength that commanded respect, Kōmyō ensured the stability of the imperial line in a time of great uncertainty. But Kōmyō's legacy was not just political. Her deep commitment to Buddhism, her influence on religious and cultural life, and her role as a patron of the faith marked her as one of the great women in Japanese history. She was not only an empress but a spiritual leader, a beacon of peace and wisdom in an era of turbulence. Her patronage of Buddhism helped to solidify its place in Japanese society, laying the foundation for future emperors to embrace the faith as a central part of their reigns. Kōmyō's support of the Buddhist community also led to the construction of several important temples and the commissioning of sacred texts, ensuring that Buddhism would remain a central spiritual force in Japan for centuries to come. As the years passed, Kōmyō grew older, but her resolve remained as strong as ever. She continued to serve as a trusted advisor to her son, offering wisdom and guidance in matters of both state and faith. Her personal devotion to the Buddha remained a cornerstone of her life, and she sought to leave a legacy of peace and prosperity for her people. It was said that even in her later years, she would spend hours in quiet meditation, contemplating the fate of the nation and the welfare of her family. Her death, which came in 680, was mourned deeply by the court and by the people of Japan. In the years that followed, her son Emperor Tenji would carry forward many of the reforms she had championed, solidifying the imperial family's authority and ensuring the stability of the nation. Kōmyō's name would live on as a symbol of wisdom, piety, and strength, qualities that transcended the political battles of her time and left a lasting imprint on Japanese history. In the centuries that followed her death, Kōmyō would be remembered not just as an empress but as one of Japan's great women, whose influence shaped the course of the nation. Her devotion to Buddhism and her quiet but powerful political acumen ensured that her legacy would endure long after her passing. And in the annals of Japanese history, Kōmyō's name would be honored as a woman who, against all odds, helped to steer Japan toward a new dawn,